terms of low carbohydrate diet, what's your experience and your feedback around female athletes? Do you have any? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm not exclusive with just men, so I do, I do talk to a female audience, Carell. And I have a number of athletes, and I just had a few that are some that are in perimenopause and some that are in menopausal, which affects progesterone and also affects a blood sugar response as well. And coming back to Edam's question, just about losing lean muscle mass is one of the issues that a lot of women have as well, and maybe it's opportunity. Are women doing strength training? And that is huge. And are they doing high intensity interval train on the swim, bike, run, but high intensity train in the gym where they're taking their exercises to really hardy fatigue, which is a huge stimulus for a protein called myokine, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So if we can elevate those myokines and they're done, ironically, the bad guys, the cytokines go up with a lot of carb intake, and they go up with a lot of long distance training, regardless of gender. So, when I look at women, one of the first things I address is, are you doing strength training? Because that's a huge seed, I use the same word, that I think a lot of endurance athletes neglect. And I see it's more prevalent, at least the women that I have worked with and for quite a while, where they're not taking the opportunity, or doesn't exist. So I think the low carb, high fat is well documented by some of the best in the world. I have my books back over here in the corner of my office that are kind of around your question.
Yeah.
And a number of them are top in the world, MDs or PhDs, and they've kind of looked at win performance. So I think your question is a good one, but I don't, drop the anchor and say, oh, women shouldn't do this. I say, absolutely do it.
Yeah. But it's true that there's an adaptability, and I did a few of the course with Dan Hughes, and there's an adaptability for women where you stretch things slightly differently, and you introduce carbs and come back out, come back in and come back out, to make sure you have that support around hormone cycle and yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, the cyclic part of the ketogenic diet, which you're referring to, where people come back and they introduce carbs, and quite often they do it for anywhere between 3 to 5 days, or around their menstrual cycle as well. One of the factors with going low carb or high fat, and certainly if you're going to nutritional ketosis, is producing those ketone bodies.
Yeah.
And it is similar to an alcoholic or someone who smokes. At some point, because the sugar is really addictive, is that everyone gravitates back towards that. And as you know, if you have too much sugar, it bops up the estrogen levels as well. Yes. So I'm very careful about doing any sort of cyclic program. I think you have to wean both men and women slowly, so that you are taking the carbohydrates out of it. But really the first thing, for all the athletes, so your mitochondria are nourished, is that you want to take out the polyunsaturated omega-6 fats. And a lot of those are in packaged foods. So, I remind athletes, I say, take a look at your pantry and tell me if you have these and what sort of package, because they're put in there for preservation.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely.
So I start with that first. Do that, and then look at the carbohydrates that are junk. And a lot of the athletes have a tendency, and certainly in the States we see it all the time. People are driving, across the country or the state, and they stop in at a quick market and they grab a Gatorade and they sit in their car with the Gatorade. I mean, it's just it's a toxic dose that elevates the blood sugar and insulin response. So weaning from those carbohydrates needs to be done slowly with both male and female.
And also it's a lifestyle change, right? If you do it too quickly, you will come back to that. But if you go slowly, step by step, then you tend to introduce new things that are much more impactful in a positive way in your everyday. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if the other listeners are following this or not, but I think I think one of the things that we, just look at from a health and aging standpoint is that we know carbohydrates are inflammatory. We eat way too many of them. and I don't know if I mentioned this, Jeff, to you in our podcast, but I had done a number of clinics and talks, and I'm an old guy, so I did one in Australia. I was there about 4 or 5 years ago, and there was a number of people that were in their 50s and 60s, and they said, "Hey, Dave, you talked about eating all those carbohydrates 25 years ago. Now you're telling us to reduce those dramatically and eat healthy fat." And my first response was, and I can stand up in front of a group and they say, "Well, you're a liar, you're da 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 da." And everyone who has been on the other side of the fence and now has really looked at the science. Tim Noakes is the best example on this, because he became a type 2 diabetic as well. And he developed one of the first, quick energy gels called Lepins. And that was sort of his product. And so he can stand in front of a group. He's a very funny guy. We've been on a couple podcasts together. I told the Aussies, I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm glad you're still alive. So start shifting your diet." We know the carbohydrates work, but we don't need them as a macronutrient. And I think the last thing is that when people think low carb, high fat, which is well defined, there's clinical guidelines on this. And so the low carb, high fat, what does that mean in carbohydrates? But it's really dependent upon lean muscle mass, metabolic rate, and also your exercise intensity, which is a huge thing. So, for example, I'm still an exercise guy, and I eat nutritional ketosis. I'm always in ketosis, but I can eat 100 grams up to 150 grams of carbohydrate, good ones, a day. Initially, you've got to go way lower than that.